Hi BookTube, welcome to a sideline because this is another patchwork. I've got so many different things I need to talk about. Almost thought maybe I should make more than one video. If it turns out upon coming to edit that I realize this is too much for one video, I'll break it up. But in the meantime, we're going to try and talk about an audiobook that I successfully finished, and also a little update about where I am with War and Peace, and some words about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Okay, let's get this show on the road because we don't have a lot of time. So I finished an audiobook. I was so amazed. Saturday, I do a lot of batch cooking at the weekends generally, and Saturday I had a big day planned. I was going to be in the kitchen most of the day, and I thought, surely I could get through an audiobook. And so I scrolled through my library's catalogue of e-audiobooks. I was looking for some non-fiction because I hadn't been very successful listening to fiction. I thought I'll see if I can find something non-fiction. And I found something, and here it is. What we listened to was Don't Touch My Hair by Emma Dabiri, published in 2019. 246 pages according to Amazon for the paperback copy. Of course, one never really knows that when they're listening, how many pages or even how many chapters. You can lose track. And I'll give you a quick summary because I'm also going to talk about just how difficult it is to give reviews for audiobooks. In summary, Emma is saying that hair texture is as much, if not more, a marker of race than skin color. And it's a cheap metaphor now for me to say that all kinds of other issues tangle together with the social acceptance of straight, smooth hair and the view of curls and coils as messy or unprofessional, or the view that protective styles for type 4 hair like braids or dreadlocks or cornrows are somehow ghetto, and I'm putting that in air quotes, or gang culture in air quotes. And I'm going to use another cheap metaphor since you can't see my face on camera. I guess I think I can get away with it. But Emma untangles these issues. She separates truth from the myths, and she goes off in some unexpected directions. Mainly this is a work of social history about blackness and hair, but it's also Emma's memoir of growing up in Ireland and Atlanta, Georgia, studying in London, and how her hair was regarded, how easily she could obtain products, hairdressers that knew what to do with her hair. And then she talks about her own transition away from those heavily used chemical relaxers and hot combs that were often, I know I had a couple of college dorm mates back in the mid 80s who had their hot combs out every day to make sure their hair was smooth and straight. And of course, I'd never seen them before that point. So you're also going to learn aspects of Yoruba culture and folklore because they make up part of Emma's heritage, and she feels she'll bring them in when she feels they have a bearing on the issue of hair. Okay, I'll put me back on camera now to talk about why did I choose this book. I mean, you all know from watching this channel that I'll read a lot of books written by Black authors, fiction and nonfiction. But this one, I suppose there was a personal angle too, and I suppose this is a good time to be grateful. In 2020, during the COVID-19 lockdown, I was doing research. Okay, everybody, I was doing research for a piece of fan fiction. I had a Black female character who was part of the franchise that I was writing about, but I needed to know how did she care for her hair? What did she do with it? I knew it was different from my memory of those two college dorm mates and their hot combs, but I didn't know anything more than that. I didn't know any why or how. And so I went on YouTube and I learned a lot. I learned a lot, not just about type 3 and 4 hair, but also about my hair, because of course I knew from the time I was a child, people always said that I had curly hair, but no one ever taught me how to look after it. Nobody ever taught me how to style it or protect it. And so I was always frustrated by how unmanageable it was. I couldn't deal with it unless I kept it quite short. So there's photographs of me that I'm going to share now on screen. This shows you how short I've kept my hair in the past, purely because I found it easier to deal with my hair when it was that short. Once I grew it, I just did not know what to do with it. It was all over the place. And then thanks to YouTube and thanks to watching Black women look after their hair and talk about how they looked after their hair, a whole new hair culture opened up for me, totally amazed me. I changed everything I did about how I looked after my hair. I went and found a textured hair specialist nearby, and now she looks after my hair. This is a shout out, not that she'd be watching, but a shout out anyway to Erica at the Muse Hairdressers in Northampton, because she does a wonderful job. And she also was a source of information too. So that's where my interest in this subject matter lies. And this is our author, Emma Dabiri, born in 1979 in Dublin, although as she'll tell you, during her growing up, she also spent quite a while in Atlanta, Georgia, and she did her university studies in London. She completed a PhD there, and she is currently teaching at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And you can see there the Penguin webpage for her as an author. And I'm also going to put a couple of links to interviews that she's done on YouTube, because she read her own audiobook, and she's a fantastic reader. And she's also very good in interview. She's really interesting to listen to. In fact, there's an interview where she's actually having her hair braided while she gives the interview. I thought that was, I just thought whoever thought of that idea was genius. If it was her, genius. But before you think, okay, are we going to get a lot more reviews now using audiobooks? I thought, it's a complicated thing. In fact, I made this little table, which I'd love to share with you. I sat down and I thought, right, what are the pros and the cons of audiobooks as opposed to print or ebooks? And so you can see my list here. And I think that, yes, the pros and the cons, they're pretty evenly weighted as far as I can see. You know, the pros are you don't need to see the text. You don't need your hands free. You don't need to be able to read, which can mean that other people can listen to the audiobook who couldn't actually read the textbook. So several people can benefit. If you put an audiobook on, if you only have one copy of a textbook, you have to read it out loud. So you have to become an audiobook. But if you have an audiobook, then you can just let it play. You can speed up or slow down the delivery of an audiobook as well. So I thought all those were good. The problem when you're making content is that I really haven't retained much about the book. Little things here and there, but I couldn't now write the script or notes for this without listening to the whole book again, because it's really difficult you can't find your way around an audiobook the way you can around an ebook. Especially ebooks are brilliant because you can just do a word search and come up, if you can't remember quite where the passage is, but you know it contained a certain word. It's just so much more time consuming to search the text. You can't annotate. You can't even describe other aspects of the book. There were illustrations in the book, apparently, but of course you don't see that on audiobook. So I think that's a shame. And I obviously couldn't see the notes. And with nonfiction, these other resources that come with the book, they're nice. And it's good to be able to say to somebody, this is what you get if you buy this book. So that's a bit of a downer, or can be, with nonfiction. And you also need, I think, the right amount of hands-free time. And this varies from person to person, doesn't it? I don't have a long commute somewhere, which would be perfect, wouldn't it, for audiobooks? Absolutely perfect. The only time that I might get a longer period of time is when I'm doing batch cooking, but even what I need to do varies from week to week. So this book took 7.5 hours to listen to. That was fine, but I don't always have 7.5 hours, and I don't really want to give 7.5 hours to an audiobook if I think I could finish a print book, ebook or physical. If I think I could finish that faster, which I think I can, I prefer to give more of my time to reading print or ebooks. So that's it for that audiobook. That's as much as you're going to get. So you really kind of have to go for it if that's your subject matter, because I again, without the print book, can't really give you more detail. So I'm just going to scoot along now and talk about War and Peace, because my experience of reading a chapter a day has gone really well. I don't know how many weeks we are in, but I have completed over 200 pages of War and Peace. I've completed book 1, parts 1 and part 2. And so I thought I'd just talk about them generally. I was in the middle of part 1 the last time I happened to mention how it was going. And of course, part 1 it's light and gossipy. It's about the lives of the rich and famous in St. Petersburg and Moscow. You are meeting aristocratic young men who are all excited about going to war, but they have no idea what going to war might actually feel like. And you end part 1 knowing that Pierre, who I remember, even though the last time I read War and Peace was when I was 14, I remember that Pierre was the character to follow because his life would be charted throughout the story. So I know that Pierre has just come into an incredible inheritance. But I wonder, because he's a bit reckless at the moment, a bit sort of all over the place, undisciplined. What kind of a man is he going to become? So that's how Book 1, Part 1 ended. Book 1, Part 2, and we go to war with all those aristocratic young men. And it's so interesting. I love part 2 because part 2 gets down at ground level and you are in the Battle of Austerlitz, which took place in 1805. You are with the Russian troops only, so you don't really get to meet the Austrians except a couple of officers who happen to interact with Russian officers. But what Tolstoy ensures is that you're at a soldier's eye view and you get a representative sample of officers and men and you watch how they conduct themselves before the battle and during the retreat and the aftermath. Not many people cover themselves in glory, but Tolstoy has a sharp sense of humor and observation. And there were a lot of moments where I was reminded of Joseph Heller's Catch-22, which I know is really strange because that's a 20th century book, but both of them kind of look at the social game of war, what can go on within a group of soldiers as they are in a conflict. It was very similar. And you also get to observe the leadership styles of different commanders. And Tolstoy, he has a joke at the expense of those men who they get a bit inflated with the idea of their own importance. And he admires those who literally cannot boast about themselves due to natural shyness, but they display natural, inspiring leadership and utter loyalty when their men are under fire. And so I recommend the story, particularly of Captain Tushin. He really does, he outshines himself more than any other officer in part 2. It was a really good story to follow. But you can see I'm having no issue getting through the book at all. In fact, I would say that reading a chapter a day is really helpful because you get time to ruminate on the chapter a little bit before you move on. And I'm actually finding it easier to remember names than I did when I just tried to read it right through as if it were any other late 20th century novel. When I treated it like what it was, a very heavy, full information book, and I was just reading in little pieces and then going away and letting it percolate, I found that I remembered characters more. And so that's another point. But I just think it's so painless. I am reading other books. I'm doing other things. I sometimes can't believe I have to look at where my bookmark is and go, my word, I've just read 200 pages of War and Peace, and it's like I haven't even done it, except that it's in my head, so I know. Right, so enough of those two. Third part of the patchwork. I want to talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and that's because Joseph Francis Burton read the book for the first time. And I love the copy you had, Joe, by the way. I didn't say it. Marion H. did. She just remarked on that incredible Walmart paperback cover. The art was incredible. There have been so many brilliant covers done for Frankenstein. I'm going to put up here, this is my copy, my battered and beaten Oxford Classics edition copy, and the bookmark that I have in it, that is some notes for an essay. I don't remember this essay, but I must have had to write it during my university degree sometime. So I couldn't even understand the notes. That was what made it really funny. But I've read Frankenstein 3 times, and I did a little bit of rereading just for the sake of this video, because it is a widely held view. I mean, Joe said when he finished the book, it just felt like an anti-science book. And that is a widely held view. And it's not that you can say, oh, well, the text doesn't back it up. I thought, well, the text can, in some places, really does. In fact, I will read you this quote where even the introduction to my Oxford Classics edition admits that it's easy to think of this as an anti-science book based on this particular quotation. Right, here we go. This is in the introduction to the book, so it's page XXIX, but we are quoting from the text of Frankenstein itself, and this is Victor Frankenstein speaking. And he says, "I pursued nature to her hiding places. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? I collected bones from charnel houses and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame in a solitary chamber. Separated from all the other apartments, I kept my workshop of filthy creation. My eyeballs were starting from their sockets in attending to the details of my employment. The dissecting room and the slaughterhouse furnished many of my materials, and often did my human nature turn with loathing from my occupation, whilst I brought my work nearer to a conclusion." And the introduction goes on to say, probably no paragraph in the book has been more influential in promoting the widely held view that the novel is anti-scientific, even anti-intellectual. But then the introduction goes on to explain why they don't think this is necessarily a good conclusion to draw from the book. So, what are my reasons? Well, first of all, the introduction says this, and Joe said it himself, that the science in Frankenstein is not science. I mean, it's not. The introduction to My Oxford Classics calls it pseudoscience. It's more magic than it is science. And that really, Mary Shelley was 18 when she wrote it. And although she came from very well-read parents, nevertheless, I don't think she could have known enough to criticize science as it was at the time. And Victor Frankenstein, it's true that he was a student of chemistry, or just describes himself as a student of the natural sciences at university. But Mary Shelley, she would have only understood chemistry as it appeared in the popular press, most likely. And she probably had never seen a working laboratory. And ironically, therefore, what she writes Victor Frankenstein doing really comes closer to magic than it does science. But that's not the most important reason. I think what tends to go unnoticed about Frankenstein, because it's a framed narrative, what we call a framed narrative. In other words, a story within a story. When we begin to read Frankenstein, what we are reading are the letters of a guy called Robert Walton. He's an explorer. He's up in the Arctic, around about Siberia, somewhere in there. And he's a scientist, and he describes his passion for exploration and how much he did his research. And then, of course, he meets Victor Frankenstein by accident. And then Frankenstein tells his story, and that story just takes over. And you really forget about Robert Walton, but that's a pity, because Robert Walton is the mirror image of Victor Frankenstein. And I think Mary Shelley, therefore, gives us a good comparison. What kind of scientist is Robert Walton versus what kind of scientist, and we use that in air quotes maybe, is Victor Frankenstein? So let's look at it. And they're both impassioned by discovery. Both Frankenstein and Walton have left home to pursue their passion. But Frankenstein did something very different than Walton. Frankenstein completely isolated himself from his friends. He stopped corresponding with his family. He sacrificed all the relationships in his life in order to pursue his goal. Now, Walton, you will see from his letters, is quite different. The fact that he's writing to his sister regularly and looks forward to her letters, a totally different man. He seems to enjoy the company of the crew that he's with, including the master, although he does say that sometimes he feels a little lonely because they don't quite understand the things that excite him. But nevertheless, he gives no impression that he keeps himself hidden away from all these people like a hermit, in the way that Frankenstein very clearly does. And if you read the end of Walton's third letter, how he describes himself to his sister, he says, "I will not rashly encounter danger. I will be cool, preserving, and prudent." Wow, you could not use those three words to describe Victor Frankenstein. Completely different approach. In fact, they're almost alter egos of each other. If you think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Walton is like the Dr. Jekyll, the man of reason, and Frankenstein is that man of unreasoned obsession, a man with no restraint. And the second point I want to make about these two men is that the differences in the way they grew up. Walton, he describes when he's young how he tried his hand at being a poet, and he talks about wanting to be a romantic, living in a paradise of my own creation. But he fails. He doesn't say why, but I wonder, because then he talks about his practical apprenticeship with the whale fishers and his study of mathematics and medicine, whether he was just by nature more of a pragmatic and logical guy, and he just didn't really want to live a poet's life in a fantasy world. Now, you compare Frankenstein, and you see a young man whose favorite authors were medieval alchemists, men whose writings promised that you would be able to transmute ordinary matter into gold. Frankenstein himself talks about those books promising that you would be able to raise devils and ghosts. And when Victor goes to university, his first chemistry professor is dismissive of all that reading and tells him, you're going to have to put that aside and do some proper science now. And Victor is frustrated. He doesn't like that. He finds real science quite boring. He doesn't enjoy his studies at first because he says they seem intent on, and I'm quoting him now, the annihilation of those visions on which my interest in science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for realities of little worth. Think about that now. Walton set aside his fantasy of being a great romantic poet in order to pursue scientific discovery. And he talks about how he desires knowledge in order to benefit mankind. Victor Frankenstein expected science to fulfill his fantasies, and that's a big difference. He desires power and the exercise of ultimate power with no consideration of whether anyone is going to benefit, including himself. And my Oxford Classics edition also talks about it's important for us to distinguish between Enlightenment science and what was almost proto-science before then in medieval times and Renaissance times. The Enlightenment emphasized that scientific work should be done in a sanctioned, public, or accessible space. There should be uniform equipment, uniform ways of measuring, uniform ways of classifying. It emphasized sharing results with the scientific community so they could be tested and proved and all the possible ramifications understood. Before that, you just had individuals working semi-secretly or totally secretly, and that's because what they were doing was on the borderline between what was acceptable and what could probably be viewed as sorcery or witchcraft, because there was a lot of very magical thinking to those pre-Enlightenment men who were looking into science. Frankenstein, I think, behaves more like a pre-Enlightenment scientist, and I think that's what Shelley is trying to emphasize. He didn't like his university education because they were trying to turn him into an Enlightenment scientist, working in a laboratory, measuring things, being careful, and he wanted none of that. He wanted what the alchemist promised. He wanted ultimate power. He wanted control over things that he had no idea whether he'd be capable of handling. And he becomes almost inhuman as a result. And I think what's interesting is that whereas Robert Walton wants to absorb nature, be with nature, understand nature to its utter limits, Frankenstein talks about how separated and alienated he became from nature the more he got into his work of recreating life. Here I'm reading from page 38 of my Oxford Classics edition. Winter, spring, and summer passed away during my labors, but I did not watch the blossom or the expanding leaves, sights which before always yielded me supreme delight. So deeply was I engrossed in my occupation. The leaves of that year had withered before my work drew near to a close. So you can see what he just lost all touch with reality, lost his relationships. It was very unnatural. And I think Walton is a healthier example of a scientist. He's a man that, yes, he leaves his home, he takes risks, but he doesn't take unnecessary risks. He works with others. What he does is known to everyone. Frankenstein, on the other hand, Frankenstein I see as something more like a reworking of Faustus, right? Frankenstein sells his soul. There's no doubt about it. The devil who possesses it is the monster that he creates. Okay, I may have got a bit carried away there. Joe, I'm really sorry, but that's how passionate I am about this book. I do believe this book speaks, but I don't think it speaks so much about science as about what happens when you desire power for its own sake, where that tends to go. And so I think it speaks a great deal to our time. But I'm going to leave it there, everybody, because I think that when I get these clips together, this is going to be a very long video. And I'm sorry, but I just really had all those thoughts on my mind. We're going to calm down on Sunday. We're going to do a Middlemarch meditation. Just keep on moving through the book. But you might get a treat because we are planning, and this is still in the planning stages, a trip to London to the British Library to see if they have the Middlemarch manuscript on display and if they have anything to say about it that might be interesting to pass on. If not, you're just going to see some lovely photographs and film footage of the library itself, because it's an amazing building. And we're going to go shopping for secondhand books nearby. Anyway, more on that at the weekend. Good reading to everybody, and I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.